Part 2 of this series, Mandala, the third dimension, the city. These will be utopian round cities, idealistic many, of Europe and unbuilt. First we'll focus on the ideals, theoretical, mandalic city plans of different kinds of utopia. Became influential through writings, but of course not built. We'll go chronologically again, beginning with Atlantis and ending with a new Atlantis. The imaginary images that we'll see depicting the cities are mainly by later artists. We'll deal with Plato, St. Augustine, the Roman architect Vitruvius, and many Italian Renaissance writers, Filarete, Sir Thomas More, Bartolomeo del Bene, Tommaso Campanella, and Sir Francis Bacon. We start with Plato's Atlantis, a legendary island lying west of the Pillars of Hercules, that is, the Rock of Gibraltar, Mediterranean. It was the Greek philosopher Plato of Athens who first told of it in 360 before the Common Era in two of his dialogues. His sources, he said, were the earlier Athenian lawgiver Solon, whose earlier sources supposedly were Egyptian priests. We see at the top an outer water ring, and then a larger ring island with horse racing stadium, a middle water ring, and a smaller ring island and an inner water ring, and a bridge and a canal to the sea down below. Atlantis, supposedly 9,000 years before Plato, was idealistically mandalic, with circular lakes and islands and a central hill with a palace, and at the top of the central hill there was a temple to Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea. At the top we see a canal to the sea, an outer harbor, 3 stades wide. A stade was about 180 meters or 600 feet. Outer ring island, middle harbor, inner ring island with fountains, hot and cold springs and baths, an inner harbor, and the central island with a bridge going to the left for traffic back and forth. So the god Poseidon on the central island. It held a giant gold statue of him, supposedly, riding a chariot pulled by winged horses. It was here that the rulers of Atlantis would come to discuss laws, pass judgments, and pay tribute to the god. Poseidon carved the inland mountain into a palace and enclosed it with 3 circular moats, each separated by rings of land and connected by bridges on the north side of the mountain. Along the bridges was a great canal, and a great wall surrounding each of the city's rings, with each passage into the city fortified by gates and towers. Plato told a mythic history of the ideal commonwealth of the Atlanteans, with the origins of their society, the geography, and the culture. The ideal climate allowed 2 harvests each year, and the island provided all kinds of herbs, fruits, and nuts, supposedly. An abundance of animals, including elephants, roamed the islands, so he said. For generations, the Atlanteans lived simple, virtuous lives and had a wonderful empire. But slowly they began to change. Greed and power began to corrupt them. As a naval power, they conquered many other lands in southern Europe and east as far as Egypt. Athenians finally came to the fore, defeating the Atlanteans and liberating everyone. That's 9,000 years before Plato. Totally not possible, of course. Then, as Plato wrote, one grievous day and night befell them, when all the warriors of Atlantis were swallowed up by the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner was swallowed up by the sea and vanished. So it was an earthquake and a massive tsunami that did them in, most likely, punished by Zeus, of course, the king of the Greek gods. The Atlantis myth may be a mere legend, but medieval European writers who received the tale from Arab geographers believed it to be true, and later writers tried to identify it with an actual location. And, as we see, many artists have greatly elaborated on it. A recent National Geographic program presented research from 2009 and 10 called Finding Atlantis. Southwest Spain, a bit inland from the Atlantic Ocean, it suggested, is the site. In surveying a marshlands area of a suspected submerged city just north of Cadiz, Spain, A team of archaeologists and geologists used a combination of satellite imagery, deep ground radar, digital mapping, and underwater technology. It's not conclusive yet. The research is still going on. So possible round city with circular waterways and a temple at the center. St. Augustine's City of God. St. Augustine wrote by hand, in Latin, De Civitate Dei, the City of God, a book of Christian philosophy. That was in the early 400s. This is his opening page, but of a later edition, of course, because it shows him, upper left, presenting it. Ancient Rome, seen as a center of the Christian world, was conquered, sacked, and burned in 410 by the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe, and the Roman Empire began to fall apart, greatly shocking all of Christianity. St. Augustine then wrote his City of God, in Latin, widely translated. In it he argued that Rome was not the heavenly city of God, it was a city of the world, where its citizens loved power, control, and domination. And he developed his concept of the Church as the spiritual city of God, distinct from any secular city. There the citizens love God, they serve one another out of charity and love, and they live with hope in the midst of the world as pilgrims on the journey. Augustine's City of God was depicted in a circular form in various translations, the most holistic shape in a way, and divided into sections. We see defensive walls, towers, and gates, and especially the hand of God symbolically touching down in the center. Christianity, he argued, should be concerned not with earthly politics, but with a mystical heavenly city, a New Jerusalem. The conflict between what Augustine called the earthly city, that is, the city of mankind, and the heavenly city of God would result in victory for God and his people. So the Church, as a circular heavenly city, would triumph throughout the world, he believed. This is a recent cover of an audiobook of the City of God in English. It's for purchase, of course. Vitruvius. Now we come to the European Renaissance, 1400s, 1500s. Marcus Vitruvius had been the most prominent Roman architect and engineer, and his writings became highly influential in the European Renaissance beginning in Italy. His books on architecture have been translated into many languages. This shows the interior of the Roman Pantheon. Vitruvius relied on the sacred geometry of Pythagoras, which held that the circle represents the spiritual realm and the square material existence. So the human body represented the perfect marriage of matter and spirit, which is reflected in its proportions, divine mathematical proportions. Vitruvius' writings and drawings were a great influence on Renaissance intellectuals, especially Leonardo da Vinci, who drew this sketch, which he called Vitruvian Man. Even temples were designed based on the proportions of the human body, Vitruvius wrote. This perfection was because the extended limbs of a perfectly proportioned human fit into both the circle and the square in this way. He also described in detail how to determine the best site and landscape for a new city, and its walls and towers, and how to lay it out symmetrically, beginning with its center, in a most circular form, with radials and concentric octagonal streets. Many other architects of the Renaissance followed Vitruvius's ideas. Importantly, like him, they placed a plaza in the center of their ideal towns and a basilica adjacent to the plaza. The centripetal force of a town core is where people could gather to be centered. This strong humanistic impulse of the Renaissance came forward at a time when the ultimate concern of scholars and artists shifted from the hereafter to this world, and interest in the sciences came to share equal footing with religion, art, music, and literature. A perfect city form would be the image of a perfect society, an idea typical of the humanist views prevalent then. With harmonious street and block arrangements and a clear relationship between the inside and the outside of the town, these town concepts were developed further by many architects then, and visualized on paper, as we are seeing. The ideal city concept testifies not only to a strong interaction between the planning of an urban space and its socio-political and spiritual institutions, but also to a lively dialogue between architectural treatises and utopian texts. In many cases, projects of ideal towns became tools through which the position of the Italian prince or king was exerted, and thereby the power of his lords of the towns was greatly enhanced. It's interesting that while the ideal city is conjured up and described in literary utopias, the social structure appears to be of primary concern, and the urban design of secondary concern. But in the ideal city, theorized in architectural treatises, the reverse is true. Design was first. The diversity of town spaces that we are seeing is common to modern town planning concepts, some of which are expressed in Howard's Garden Cities of Tomorrow, as we'll see later, and in Le Corbusier's town planning. Essentially based on the Roman Vitruvius, these key concepts about town planning, in some measure, show the continuity of the Renaissance with modern town planning ideas. So we come to our fourth ideal city, in a way, Sforcinda. It is perhaps the best example of utopian city planning, and actually the first ideal city plan of the time. It was designed by Filarete, an architect, sculptor, and architectural theorist from Florence, Italy, and he named his proposed city after his sponsor. Filarete is a Greek word for lover of excellence. In his Trattato de Architectura of 1457, Filarete showed how the auspicious powers of geometry and astrology should be used. Each of the outer points of the star had towers, while the inner angles had gates. Each of the gates was an outlet of radial avenues that passed through small market squares. All the avenues finally converged in 3 central squares, one for the prince's palace, one for a large commercial market, and especially one for the cathedral. A canal system would connect with a river, shown here, and thus with the outside world, that is, for the import and export of goods. He drew many fanciful buildings that would be included. However, Sforcinda was never built, because his sponsor, Francesco Sforza, never came through with the funds. The basic layout of the city would be an 8-pointed star, created by overlaying 2 squares so that all the corners were equidistant. This shape was then inscribed within a perfectly circular moat. It is thought that Plato's description of Atlantis and St. Augustine's City of God may have inspired preoccupations with geometry in city layouts by many Renaissance humanists, not just Filarete. But he was the first to develop the ideas of a utopia into the plan of a city. So we go forward in time to our 5th idealized city. A few decades later, the British Sir Thomas More, Lord Chancellor of England, published this book, first written in Latin and then later translated into German and English. It's a narrative depicting a fictional island society and its customs. It was his indirect way of commenting on the political and social ideas of his times. Utopia was his invented word from the Greek or utopos, meaning no place or no place in particular. It became the archetype of the utopian city ideal, which flourished later. Placed somewhere in the New World, his mythic island had the basic shape of a circle, with a large harbor inside, yet its features certainly seem Old World in appearance. That is, castles, spires, Christian crosses. The physical shape of the urban environment where social life takes place was fully connected with its social organization and the behavior of its citizens. More's description of Utopia is told to him by a mysterious traveler who discovered it and lived there, shown here lower left in a later publication, in support of his argument that communalism is the only cure against egoism in private and public life. In More's Utopia, there is no private ownership. It has free hospitals, and meals are taken in community dining halls. Goods are stored in warehouses, and people would request what they need, and their needs would be met. There are also no locks on the doors of the houses. All the inhabitants live in the countryside, and all able-bodied citizens must work, with women doing the same work as men, mainly in agriculture. These woodcut illustrations are from a later edition. But they must also learn a practical trade, but only have to work for 6 hours a day. Education and health care would be free and universal, with citizens encouraged to apply themselves to learning in their leisure time. There are several religions on the island: moon worshippers, sun worshippers, planet worshippers, ancestor worshippers, and monotheists, but each is tolerant of the others. Yet all these agree in the main point, which is worshipping the divine essence. The word utopia from More's short work has been used ever since to describe this kind of imagery, an imaginary society with egalitarian and communalistic views. The word became more famous than the book eventually. No place in particular. The connection between the planning and the circular island city and the customs and ethics of its inhabitants is derived from the thought of classical texts, mainly of Plato, Vitruvius. But it came to influence many other writers and dreamers of utopia in the years to come, like several that we will look at soon. City of Truth. An Italian philosopher was the uncle of a bishop in France, Bartolomeo del Bene, and about 1565 he conceived of a city of ideas in a book, Civitas Veri. It was an allegorical, philosophical poem written in Latin. His city of truth would have a physical shape, a circular plan that would use solid stone and a wall with towers to protect the town. These engravings were meant to illustrate his ideas. The poem is a recasting of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It describes a month-long spiritual journey undertaken by his patroness Marguerite, Duchess of Savoy, who travels through the City of Truth, from its 5 sectors and gates, one for each of the senses. These gates symbolize how sense perceptions enter the psyche. Each is the entrance to a row of 7 courtyards leading into a central circle. Between the 5 rays of the courtyard systems, there would be water and mist flowing out, billowing out into green spaces, gardens and orchards. Marguerite walks through the city's various palaces and gardens. And she goes up to the center of the City of Truth with 5 temples on top, where Aristotle meets her to explain and show them to her. Each is dedicated to his intellectual virtues, and so the inner paths of her psyche must ascend to them all. This is the temple of art and craft expertise, but there's also the temple of science, the temple of intuitive understanding, the temple of practical wisdom, and here the temple of theoretical wisdom. He would give instruction in each temple about politics and morality, intelligence and spirit, virtues and vices. Somewhat following the fashion of Thomas More's Utopia, Del Bene presented his City of Truth as both a microcosm and as an idealized location, a round mandala with a sacred center and dedicated to truth. So we move forward now in time to 1602 and our 7th ideal city, Tommaso Campanella's Civitas Solis, the City of the Sun, or La Città del Sole, is an important early utopian work, written while he was imprisoned in Spain by the Catholic Inquisition. This is his Latin version, which he did later on. The City of the Sun is presented as a dialogue between a Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller and a sea captain from Genoa. His ideal city, exactly circular, was to be governed by people enlightened by reason, not by the church, with everyone's work designed to contribute to the good of the community. This equitable division of labor would be based on the capabilities and the inclinations of the individuals. There would be communal ownership of wealth, and private property and poverty would be non-existent, very communal. Conceived as a representation of the known universe, it would be over 3 kilometers or 2 miles across, and have a central temple of the sun, here Sol, and 7 circular walls representing the 7 circuits of Mercury, Venus, Earth, Moon, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The outer circle here signifies the fixed stars, the immobile stars. These next images are all modern. As people would travel the circuits of a wall, rings named after the planets, they would move like the planets and absorb a degree of knowledge. Gardens surround the city. This shows 2 versions of the Sun City. In the central temple of the sun, the altar is in the form of the sun and would hold both a celestial and a terrestrial globe. The route to true knowledge is through the senses rather than through reason, Campanella imagined. So he fantasized education as an outdoor classroom with walls of the city being fully illustrated, carved, textbook walls in a way, with murals and alphabets everywhere. People of all ages would learn through looking at the concave and convex walls. Number 1, mathematics on the outer wall, all places on the earth as well. Number 2 are minerals, metals, precious stones, liquids and liqueurs. And 3, flora and fish in both freshwater and seawater. 4 is birds, reptiles, and insects. And 5, all land animals, especially including horses. 6 is all the handicrafts, their tools, and prominent men of law, war, and science. The carved walls are disciplines. The carved and frescoed didactic walls gird the city in concentric, very mandalic circles, making education easy, pleasant, and available to all, even with images painted on walls of buildings too. Dignified labor, education, scientific inquiry, and hygiene all would be of great value, egalitarian and communal. It is all to constitute a support to the instruction of the young citizens, as it is written. All that materially contributes to the good life has been perfected, as the sea captain explained to the Grand Master. And in advocating utopian communalism for the inhabitants, Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun owes a great deal to Plato's Atlantis and Thomas More's Utopia. A final utopic work we'll consider was titled New Atlantis by Sir Francis Bacon, narrative fiction again. Since it was published after his death, it's called a work unfinished. An exotic and mythic island again here, with ideal living based on material research and advances in science. Bacon was Lord Verulam, Viscount of St. Alban, as it says below. Science and technology could be harnessed to benefit mankind, he believed, but he's the one who became known as the founder of empiricism, establishing and popularizing the scientific method of inquiry into natural phenomena. Very important, scientific method. The setting is an island called Ben Salem, only somewhat round, discovered by a European ship that got lost finally in the Pacific somewhere. Their wise rulers have great integrity and oversee a culture of family values and social generosity. Many are the advances in industry and breakthroughs in the natural sciences. 16 are predicted at the bottom of this etching. This passion for science, by the way, was quite common in the 1600s. I've divided this image into 3 sections, the upper, middle, and lower thirds, and have the alphabets there, A through F, circled in yellow. First we have A, wildfires burning in water at the left, could be volcanoes forming new islands. B, engine houses studying motion, maybe aeronautics. Flying in the air is C, for seeing airplanes and rockets. D, instruments for seeing far away, telescopes today. And E is light, intensified and thrown far away, lasers likely today. Glasses to see very closely, perfectly, microscopes. Foreseeing future science, a la Bacon. G in the center, through K, mostly off to the right. Perspective houses or ateliers for studying light and color. Optics, chromatics, art schools. H is pools to strain fresh water from salt, the big desalinization plants that we have now. I, gardens, bearing more speedily than their nature. Greenhouses nowadays. J, animals and fruit changes, implying genetics. We see a gigantic chicken and a tiny cow up there. K is fruit much larger than its nature. Genetic manipulation again. Monstrous strawberry in a wheelbarrow, as we see. All scientific fiction? It was back then. Here it is no longer the philosopher who is king, as in Plato, but the scientist. Now at the lower third of this woodcut, numbers L through P. L, aids to improve hearing, of course, foretelling hearing aids. M is sound houses for studying sound, foreshadowing engineering studios. We see musical instruments out in front. N, sound conveyed in tubes. Two fellows we see, implying telegraphs, telephones, even internet computers. O is deep caves, super root cellars it looks here, now refrigerators very common. P, even ships sailing underwater, over at the far lower left, submarines of today. Bacon's 1624 fiction has become reality today. After that, many editions followed the first. Educated readers delighted in the fantasy of a utopian land where generosity and enlightenment, dignity and splendor, piety and public spirit, as Bacon wrote, are all qualities of the inhabitants of Ben Salem. New foods and textiles are found, as well as artificial minerals and cements and chambers where diseases can be cured. Even with all the experimentation on the island, it is the practical application of the knowledge which was gained that's most important. At the heart of New Atlantis is a city-sponsored college called Solomon's House, a vast research institution. Its aim was to find the knowledge of causes and the secret motion of things, as Bacon wrote. Knowledge of causes. Secret motion. His fiction tries to examine almost anything the 17th century mind could possibly imagine. Francis Bacon, like More and Plato before him, proved himself a true utopian in New Atlantis, with the words, "We must begin anew from the very foundations." As he said, unless we go around in circles for what others call progress, contemptible progress, he called it, we must begin anew from the very foundations. Part 3 can be next, a different DVD if you wish. Circular cities that were actually built, idealistic, and some rather utopic, in Europe.